Okay, now to the formal introduction. Dr. Jason Kennedy Duncan. Now, the mother wanted to name him, his middle name, Kennedy. The father wanted him to be named Nixon. Mom won out. He hails from Albany, New York, but his first career was in Washington, D.C. in politics, and he was for several years a legislative assistant to a member there on the Hill. And have a beer with Jason to find out how Congress really works, or doesn't these days, but he has all kinds of insights into how Washington works. Well, the experience of watching how sausage is made, which is, of course, how Bismarck defined politics, drove Jason to consider a career change and to move into education. He first got his master's degree at Georgetown, and I think this is very prescient. He got a master's degree in Russian studies. Now, how vital is that when you're going to later write a biography of John F. Kennedy? It's a pretty good pick that he had there. And then he went to the University of Iowa, and he got his PhD, earned his PhD in 1999. Jason joined the Aquinas faculty in 2002, and he's won a gaggle of awards there for teaching and service. He became head of the history department in the summer of 2008, the chair there. And his current book project, as I've already alluded to, is John F. Kennedy, The Burdens of Cold War Liberalism, which will be published by Routledge in 2012. Now, all of that is very interesting, but I haven't told you the most interesting thing about Jason yet. The most interesting thing about Jason is that he's in the rookie year of his marriage to Amy Richards in our front row, and they're going to have their first child in late March. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jason Duncan.
Good evening. Thanks for being here. It's an honor to speak from a podium which so many great historians have spoken. My thanks to the Hallenstein Center at GVSU, especially Glees, Whitney, his staff, Brian, Kathy, Adam, and Liza. Thanks to the Ford Museum, especially Elaine Didier and Jim Kratzis. It's an honor to be here. Thanks to the audience for coming out on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. So many friends I see, political allies, and of course my wife, Amy. And I can guarantee you the name Nixon, with all due respect, our 37th president will not be in the name of our child. Kennedy is still an option, but no Nixon. I think you see my point here. So this is a red letter date in modern American history. As we all know, it was on this date in 1963 that John F. Kennedy was shot and killed in Dallas, Texas. He was the fourth American president to die from an assassin's bullet. This is a day we remember John F. Kennedy. His birthday is May 29th, but that is known only to real Kennedy specialists. It is this day we look back in the president in the early 1960s. So I'm quite glad to have the chance tonight to share a few thoughts with you on the book that has been long awaited by the reading public, and especially those who study history. And that is Jacqueline Kennedy's interviews in 1964 with Arthur Schlesinger, an historian of some renown, in which she spoke just a few months after Dallas about her memories of her husband, their 10 years of marriage, the life together, and she has insights I think you'll find interesting. So, interest in the 35th president continues. Just this month alone, there's two recent books of interest through the reading public. Chris Matthews, you may know from MSNBC. If you watch that program, there's a new book out called Jack Kennedy, the Elusive Hero. Basically, it's a favorable treatment. I can understand this, he's very interested in all things Kennedy. He remembers Kennedy's life. He says, when he was in the Peace Corps in Africa in 1969, on his transistor radio, he heard the moonshot, and he thought, that's JFK. The Peace Corps, the space program. And so that was at the center of his interest. His book, I've not read it yet, but it's largely a favorable treatment of Kennedy, one of his heroes. The other book is a work of fiction by Stephen King, noted novelist. 11/22/63, in which a main character goes back in time to try to stop assassination. So that is also available. But our book, the focus of my talk tonight, is Jacqueline Kennedy's book. As I said, these are based on interviews she gave in 1964 with Arthur Schlesinger. The book includes many photographs, audio disc, and as a foreword by Caroline Kennedy, John and F. Kennedy's and Jackie Kennedy's surviving child. The introduction and the footnotes in the book are done by the presidential historian Michael Beschloss, and the book very quickly went to the top of the New York Times bestseller list, as well as #1 on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. So the interest in the Kennedys continues, and I think your presence here tonight is evidence of that. Well, originally, these interviews were to be sealed for 50 years after they were given. Mrs. Kennedy died in 1994, and since then, there's been some pressure on the family to release them. But with the 50th anniversary of JFK's presidency this year, and with the loss of several important Kennedy stalwarts, including Sargent and Eunice Shriver, the president's sister and brother-in-law, Theodore Sorensen, his close policy aide, Arthur Schlesinger himself, who conducted the interviews, and most prominently, Ted Kennedy. So with these passing of a generation, I guess Caroline thought it's time to release these transcripts to the public. They are unedited. There are some things in here that are surprising, but they're definitely a product of their time. Mrs. Kennedy was only 34 when she sat down with Schlesinger. Her views on many of these issues, especially I think the role of a woman in marriage would change, the role of civil rights leaders would change, but at this moment, she speaks quite bluntly, and I think it's to her daughter's credit that the interviews are not edited. And I think we can appreciate that. I can appreciate that as an historian, and hope you can too. So, these are the most extensive interviews Jackie Kennedy ever gave about her 10 years of marriage with JFK. They're married in 1953, and of course he was killed in 1963. Like most interviews, the format followed by Schlesinger and Mrs. Kennedy are a series of questions with short, relatively short, and punchy answers. Now, she doesn't go into great depth in the course of these 7 interviews at any one topic, but they sort of jump back and forth. Some are about personality, some are about politics, some are about their marriage, some are about public issues, but it's clear that she is sort of speaking from the heart. Now, what does one make of these interviews? Well, I think in part that will be determined by one's preconception of the Kennedys. They remain a very controversial family, obviously. Few people are neutral on the subject, so if you are inclined to look back in the early 60s as a moment of great hope and promise with a youthful president, his young wife, their small children, a belief in the American future and progress that perhaps we've lost since then, and I think you would find these interviews comforting, reassuring, a nostalgic glow about them. If you are skeptical of presidents and people in power, if you think John F. Kennedy was not all he appeared to be at the time, and certainly his reputation has taken some serious hits, so to speak, for revelations since the time he was in the White House. So, it's also worth keeping in mind that these interviews are very much a Kennedy family production. Caroline Kennedy, Arthur Schlesinger, Mrs. Kennedy originally, they're very much within the Kennedy circle. So there is a bias, I suppose, to it. And the Kennedy family has long understood the importance of presentation and packaging of images dating back at least to Joseph Kennedy's career as a Hollywood producer in the 1920s. So the Kennedys have always really shaped their image quite skillfully in the public eye, and I think these interviews are part of that. So that's worth keeping in mind, not to be overly skeptical or even cynical, but they know what they're doing when it comes to putting the best foot forward. Of course, we all like to do that ourselves. So, the one thing that was not in the book, and someone just moments ago asked me about the more salacious aspects of it, but there really aren't, as it turns out. There were some rumors on the internet before the publication of certain wild theories about the assassination that she would reveal here, but really there's nothing that was going to really change our view of JFK or his presidency dramatically. So that's it. So if I don't want to mislead you, if that's what you're looking for tonight, you're free to go. I don't want to hold you here. Keep your Thanksgiving cooking from getting started or anything. If you're looking for a real sort of big moment. So that is not there. By that I mean she doesn't really go into the assassination. She spoke about it briefly with William Manchester in the 60s, but she and Schlesinger avoid the topic. There's a few references to Dallas, or she says after Jack's death, but that really isn't the focus of the interviews. And she also doesn't describe marital difficulties. This part did surprise me a little bit. Now, she really doesn't delve into his alleged, and probably some, if it is true, infidelities. She really doesn't treat that subject. Now, I was thinking, if she had sat down with Barbara Walters, say, about 1990, or even 1980, or maybe even 1970, I think Barbara was interviewing even in the 60s, we might have the whole story. So in that way, it's a bit frustrating if you're looking for like the full picture of the marriage. She doesn't give it here. And why is that? Why is that? Well, I think because she very much was a young woman, 34 years old. Her identity was really wrapped up with her husband's, and suddenly he's gone. They have 2 small children she has to raise without their father. The Kennedys are still quite ambitious, and she's a part of their family. And I think her loyalty to her husband comes out in these interviews. So she doesn't go into that. I think perhaps most importantly, she's a very private person. Jacqueline Kennedy was known for her privacy, her commitment to it, and I think by the time of her death in 1994, that really made her stand out. I mean, we are in a celebrity-driven culture increasingly, and people want to know. They want to know, we want to know everything, every last detail about the powerful and the famous and the rich. And she just wouldn't have that. She was a private person. She never really unveiled her whole life, which makes her, I think, increasingly intriguing. Now, one of the things that is quite apparent from the early tapes here is that Jacqueline Kennedy, or Jackie as I refer to her here, she definitely considered herself married to John F. Kennedy. I mean, you hear so much about the negative side of the marriage, her husband's affairs, that I think it's easy to forget they were married. I remember this past year I was in Ireland reading a book. I got to teach there in the spring. And I read a book called JFK in Ireland, about his 4 days in Ireland in June of '63. And in the book, which was quite detailed, like every minute of Kennedy's day, he said at night he went back and he called Jackie back in Washington, back in the White House. For some reason, that surprised me. I don't know why I don't know if that would surprise you or not, but it surprised me because you get the impression from some of the Kennedy books that it wasn't a real marriage. But she definitely considered it true, important, strong, a real relationship, and of great importance to her. She speaks with her husband, who was 12 years her senior, with a mixture of awe, reverence, respect, and loyalty, and also, I would say, love. Now, this is consistent with what you said in another place to Father Richard McSorley in 1964, a Jesuit priest in Georgetown, was a spiritual advisor around the same time period as she gave these interviews. And she basically told Father McSorley that she was absolutely devastated by Dallas, what happened to her husband, that she missed him terribly. She wished to be with him as soon as possible in heaven. She even told the priest that she was considering suicide. And he tried to say, well, if you do that, you might be separated forever, so don't do that. But I think her grief was real, and maybe another book, someday we'll ferret out the full story of the marriage, but from her perspective in 1964, it was quite important to her. Also, one of the Secret Service agents in Dallas that day, Clint Hill, you may know that name, he helped push Mrs. Kennedy back onto the limousine after the shots. He also said, and he saw them at close quarters, that theirs was a real marriage. They relied on each other. So, Even without any shocking revelations, I think there is much in these interviews of interest. So, Jackie Kennedy spoke of her relationship to her husband, and she deferred to him in a way that is probably much more reminiscent of the way we think of the American family and marriage after World War II than it is today. She saw her role as a wife was to provide a warm, happy environment in the private quarters of the White House, in which her husband could return in the evening for relaxation and merriment after a difficult day at a demanding job. So in that way, she seems to have a typical attitude of a middle-class American wife or a wealthy American wife, and the difference is that her husband was working at the most demanding job in the world, arguably. But she basically thought that was her chief duty, not to disagree with him, not to challenge him, but to support him and be there for him at the end of the day. She even went so far as to say, and the best type of marriage is one based on a Victorian or even Asiatic model, in which the wife is clearly subservient. And now later in her life, Mrs. Kennedy, I'm sure, would have repudiated, I would imagine she would have repudiated that, but not in these tapes. So she said that with regards to politics, that Jack's opinions were the best. He was president, he was informed, he knew the information. Why would she have a different opinion than him? That was her attitude. As a father, she speaks of her husband's deep fondness for the children. She talks about him tumbling around on the floor as they try to follow the lead of the TV exercise man, Jack LaLanne. It was a staple of television. Some of you remember that. I barely do, but I can tell some of you do. Maybe you followed along with him as well. And so the president's on the floor with his children, and he clearly enjoyed that. And she said it was almost sensuous the way he would sort of tumble around with the kids as they try to do their push-ups and New Frontier sit-ups in the 1960s. So she pictures the family as the very ideal of domestic bliss, even in the midst of the fishbowl that is the modern White House. Now, since the early 60s, as I'm sure almost all of you know, the Kennedy image has really, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, been greatly, what's the right word, revised or maybe even overthrown. And there's been a whole range of books starting in the 1970s that really take issue with this perfect family in the White House. And unfortunately, for those who admire JFK, there's much evidence to back up the revisionist view. Subsequent historians and writers, such as Seymour Hersh, in his 1998 book, The Dark Side of Camelot, emphasize Kennedy's recklessness, dishonesty, extramarital affairs of a very dangerous type. But these are not part of Jacqueline Kennedy's history. I wouldn't take her story as complete, but I wouldn't take the revisionist Dark Side of Camelot as a whole story either. And all marriages are complicated. As Caroline said in an interview with Diane Sawyer when the book was released in September, some of this is their business. Only they knew. And if I know what she said, I'm not going to go into that. That's for them. That was between them as husband and wife. Well, what are some of the things that, in specific, besides being a good husband, as she sees it, at least she said she did, that she emphasized about JFK? One of the things that really struck me, and this is a real main theme of the book, this comes up over and over, and it's interesting. She often uses the word bitter and bitterness many times about people bitter, perhaps her own bitterness, and maybe that's why she kept making that use of that word, because she had such an ideal life taken away from her in an instant. So she probably had reason to feel bitter. And she talks about this person being bitter, and that person. But as I mentioned, her emphasis is her husband's lack of bitterness, lack of grudge holding, which might seem unusual for an Irish-American politician. But Brandon could probably speak to that later in the lobby. But his father, Jack's father, Joe, essentially confirmed this. He once said he didn't fully understand his second son because Jack does not hate like I do. Although he had hopes that Bobby would eventually reach that goal, such as it is. And he said that Jack is more like his mother. He doesn't hold grudges. And I think part of this resistance to not giving into that temptation There's a few things. I think he was basically a happy person. He had a lot to be happy about, except for his health. He certainly had a lot to be thankful for. But it's also rooted in a politician's ambition. Why make an enemy over something small? Why get bogged down into grudges, resentments, petty disputes that are going to waste your energy, waste your time, hold you back, and just create bad will? And I think Abraham Lincoln was much the same way. So it's not just altruism on Kennedy's part or a sunny disposition that he might have been blessed with, but I really think he thought he was too ambitious for that. And I think that's part of what he is going on with that. So Jackie makes the case of uses the case of Ted Sorensen to make the point. And this struck me as one of the more interesting anecdotes in the interviews. Sorensen, as you may know, was Kennedy's top intellectual aide. He was with him for 10 years, from 53 to 63. He was Kennedy's speechwriter. He wrote articles. They wrote together. And when Kennedy published under his name Profiles in Courage, a series of 8 biographical sketches of U.S. senators who Kennedy argued had shown exceptional integrity and an independence of mind, for that book, he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in biography, of which he was quite proud. But almost immediately, there were allegations and whispers of plagiarism, that Sorensen was the real author, that Sorensen did it, and Jack put his name on it and accepted the Pulitzer Prize that really should have gone to Mr. Sorensen. Now, Kennedy, for the rest of his life, hotly disputed this. He hired the best D.C. political lawyer to threaten with libel, a columnist who had said this in a column, and got him to retract it. And he really resented this allegation. Now, who wrote Profiles in Courage? I think they probably both did. JFK wrote some chapters, Sorensen wrote some chapters, they collaborated, and Kennedy gave ample acknowledgments of Sorensen's role in the foreword to the book. But Jackie thought, and Ted Sorensen, as I guess, wrote people the wrong way. Kennedy's Irish mafia from Boston thought he was too liberal, too intellectual, too aloof. And Jackie also thought he's not doing enough to knock down this rumor. He sort of likes the fact that people are speculating he wrote the book. And Jackie said she was so furious at Sorensen, she couldn't even look at him for about 2 years. But then she said, there's Jack. He didn't either pick up on that or mind it. He even gave the royalties to the book to Sorensen. So she said that's a good example of his generosity and forgiving attitude towards people that Jackie frankly felt bitter toward. Well, she also spoke admiringly of JFK's interest in people, ideas, and books, and especially his voracious reading habits. Now, John F. Kennedy once said that when he was asked in a survey, what's your best trait? And he said, curiosity, curiosity. Jackie confirmed this. She said her husband was voracious in his reading. He'd read while getting dressed, while walking, taking a bath, as much as often as he could. And Kennedy's first campaign manager from his 1946 House race, Mark Dalton, said much the same thing. He said, in private, Kennedy could be rather quiet. He would often slip away from meals, from meetings to read by himself. So Jackie sort of confirms that view of John F. Kennedy. Well, what did he like to read? History and biography, almost exclusively. History and biography, especially, and this is one of the things that surprised me, British history, British biography. Now, as a student at Harvard, young Jack Kennedy had studied European history more than American. And Jackie noted that at times his interest actually seemed stronger in British history and European history than in U.S. history. She noted that when she took a class in American history at Georgetown University, and she came home excited. This is when they were living in Georgetown, when he was in the Senate, and she was quite eager to share the details with him of her class, and she tried to engage him in discussion on the Trust Busters, the Progressive Era, and he wasn't particularly interested, which kind of puzzled her because it wasn't what he was about. Well, when Mrs. Kennedy herself impressed French leader Charles de Gaulle with her knowledge of French history at a banquet, her husband said, my God, that would be like me sitting next to Madame de Gaulle and her asking me all about Henry Clay, the 19th century politician. In other words, something he really didn't particularly know a lot about, as he admitted. But she also admitted that Jack was quite fascinated on another occasion in listening to the historian David Herbert Donald lecture on Abraham Lincoln. So again, if it's biographical and presidential, he's interested. Henry Clay ran for president 4 times, never made it, because Jack had less interest, perhaps, in the losers in that regard at least. So, but his interest in history, as I said, really seems directed at biography and personality. His Profile in Courage book was a study of 8 U.S. senators, and this really seemed to attract him, the individual facing dilemmas, facing up to moral decisions, to political pressure. This impressed him more, this attracted him more than studying, for example, economics or society, and even those things are both very important. I suspect that Kennedy's focus on biography puts him in company with a lot of people out there, if the bestseller list are any indication. But could this have a downside, this intensely personal approach to life and to history? Well, Sir Isaiah Berlin, the British scholar who met with Kennedy in the White House to discuss the Soviet Union, took note of this tendency in Kennedy's thinking as well, that it was very personal, that it was always about the people but not the systems or the theory behind the systems or the ideas behind the system. Now, latter generations of social historians have characterized this as great man history, but I think Kennedy was interested in that through the exclusion of much other types of writing about the past. Well, this could be potentially dangerous. At Kennedy's meeting with Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev in 1961 in Vienna, he was warned by the CIA not to get into a philosophical discussion with Khrushchev about the theories of capitalism and Marxist-Leninism. He was told that. Stay away from it. Khrushchev's going to want to talk to you about that. Don't go there. Keep it on concrete, specific issues, but don't wade into the theory of labor and capital. He'll clobber you. And Kennedy had great confidence in his intellect, great confidence in his ability to charm people. He didn't charm Khrushchev, and really Khrushchev hammered him theoretically. And it's a bit ironic. This American man, the son of a millionaire, Ivy League educated from Harvard, squaring off with the son of a Ukrainian-Russian peasant who may have studied metallurgy and engineering or something along the way, but absolutely taking Kennedy to task because the Soviet Union was such an ideological society. You had to learn the theory, and Khrushchev did, Kennedy didn't, and it really did not go well from the American side. So, was John Kennedy an intellectual or not? Well, I think he was certainly curious about things he was interested in, but as Jackie pointed out, but it might be a stretch to consider him a Renaissance man in the tradition of Thomas Jefferson, for example, for whom Kennedy had great admiration. For one thing, the body of knowledge in the 20th century was so much greater than the 18th, and Kennedy was primarily a man of action, more than he was one of ideas. Now, his own political philosophy, Jackie does not go into in great depth, but he was once asked about that, and he got a blank look on his face. He really was not an abstract thinker. His mind just really didn't orient toward that. But what do we know about it from other sources? Well, his philosophy is not easily defined. He started out as a conservative Democrat. He represented working class Irish and Italian Catholics in the Boston area in the House of Representatives. And he was once asked, well, what is your political philosophy anyway? And he said, I'm a Massachusetts Democrat. And by that he didn't mean, as our ears would hear today, that he's in the left wing of the Democratic Party. So he didn't mean it as identifying with liberalism, but more about a basic social and religious conservatism. But as he advanced, he did change somewhat. In 1952, he ran for the U.S. Senate as a moderate Democrat against a well-respected moderate Republican, Henry Cabot Lodge. It was not a really, it was a campaign conducted at a very high level. Both candidates respected each other, and I think Kennedy, when he got to the Senate, became a bit more liberal. But there's still a certain lack of full connection with liberalism. He once said he wasn't comfortable with liberals. He didn't join the Americans for Democratic Action, the liberal interest group. And he also had some rocky relations with Eleanor Roosevelt, the great liberal icon of the period, as well as Adlai Stevenson. But as Jackie Kennedy said of her husband, he had many aspects to his personality. And this is one of the things that other Kennedy biographers have picked up on. He, like maybe most of us, or some of us, or maybe a few of us, it's hard to say, he tended to have many different parts of his life and different people in those compartments. As Jackie said, he loved all the people in all parts of his life, and they loved him. He had his family, first and foremost, his beloved Boston Irish mafia, his more liberal advisors like Schlesinger and Sorensen, his friends in politics and the arts, his friends from prep school and Harvard, and the Navy. And he very much enjoyed being at the center of these connections. He really much enjoyed that, with the different aspects connecting at him. But sometimes this putting people in the compartments could cause hurt. Bobby Kennedy, Jack's brother, his attorney general, on whom he increasingly lied during his presidency, for example, was never invited to the White House family quarters for dinner. Never. Not once in almost 3 years. As Jackie put it, Jack did not, and Bobby resented this, naturally enough. And as Jackie put it, Jack did not care to see the same people at night who he worked with during the day, and this included his own brother. So there is that aspect of his personality that could inflict pain on those who were closest to him. Well, this semester I've been teaching a course on American Catholic history, and one of the things that's come up is, how religious was John F. Kennedy? What kind of a Catholic was he? Well, Jackie said that Jack never missed Mass on Sundays. He would say his prayers at night, albeit rather quickly. He went to confession regularly, and he said the rosary at times of great personal crisis. Jackie said that her husband certainly was a believer, but he occasionally raised doubts about God, about Christianity, and about the Catholic Church. If it was all true, she said, he wanted to have it on his side, which, as Schlesinger points out, is Pascal's wager. Doesn't necessarily speak of deep religious faith, but that was her view of his religion as she saw it. Now, Jackie said that her husband was very much immersed in hero worship, which is a bit ironic given his posthumous career, I suppose, in American culture. But if he did have a hero, it was Winston Churchill. He admired British politicians greatly, and he was especially close to the British Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, a much older man than Kennedy. As Jackie said of them, that was a very rare and touching relationship between these two men. They really loved each other. And one of Kennedy's very close friends was David Ormsby Gore, British ambassador to the United States in the early 60s, who Kennedy had met back in the 30s when he was a young man in Britain, and they maintained their friendship. One model for Kennedy's political career were the British Whig politicians of the 18th and 19th centuries, men from wealthy aristocratic backgrounds who were opposed to the king, more on the liberal side of British politics. And one of Jack's favorite books was Melbourne, which was about one of those politicians. As Jackie said of him, I think one of the more interesting insights in the book, these great Whig houses and Whig liberal families who, had everything and lived a stimulating life, yet cared. So they're people with great advantages, great wealth, but they managed to be concerned with public issues. Jackie further said, I really thought it was really British history he patted himself on more than ours, and she mentions his love of a famous speech from the great 18th century Anglo-Irish statesman Edmund Burke, the electors of Bristol, in which Burke argues that elected officials owe their constituents their informed conscience more than simply representing them narrowly. This was the theme, of course, of Profiles in Courage. So I think as we look at Kennedy as a politician, he wasn't a populist, either of a genuine type or of the less genuine type. I think he was a different type of leader. You might even think he was an aristocrat. But I think the English angle can be taken too far, and this might get back to his compartmentalization. Despite being something of an Anglophile, he became the first head of state to lay a wreath on the graves of the Irish patriots executed by the British after the 1916 Easter Rising. So in addition to being quite admiring of the British, he also had a deep love and respect for Ireland and his great interest in his Irish roots. Well, Jack Kennedy once said that irritability was his worst trait. He said that more than once. But Jackie mentioned that several times in the interviews that her husband was not irritable at home or with her ever. So that does strain credulity somewhat, and that seems a little bit hard to believe, but she made that point. But this does not quite comport with what Kennedy's longtime secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, said about her time in his office in the 1950s when he was so ill-tempered by the pain in his back that she seriously considered leaving his employment, even though she thought he was heading for the presidency. More recently, New York Times columnist Maureen Dowd, a great iconoclast of the 21st century, said that her brother worked in the Senate as a page in the 50s, and his brief encounters with Kennedy were also marked by the latter's irritability. Well, Jack Kennedy's health was not good, his physical health. Jackie does not shy away from that too much, although she doesn't delve into great detail, she does acknowledge it. And one of the more poignant comments in the book, she quotes her husband as saying, "I wish I had had more good times. I wish I had had more good times." And I think that's a clear reference to his physical health. He was rarely fully healthy ever in his entire life. Now, Jack Kennedy once told a friend he never had an unhappy day in his life, so it's a little bit hard to reconcile the two. But I think that, as Robert Dowlick pointed out in his book of 2003 on Kennedy, that his health woes were severe, they were serious. And even though we think of JFK as a charismatic, glamorous figure, and I guess will always be remembered in part for that, I think the fact that he overcame great health issues is really a testament to his exceptional determination, stamina, and toughness that I think is just as important as his charisma. Probably more important. Well, of course, John F. Kennedy was first and foremost a politician, an all-consuming political career. One does not get elected President of the United States at the age of 43 without being focused on the goal in the 20th century. Now, Jackie said that people assume we didn't talk about politics at home. I'm not sure why people would assume that, but she seemed to think that was the case. But she said all we talked about was politics. So obviously he was consumed by it. Now, Jackie's grasp of politics, both in terms of the people in it and the issues, is more impressive here than one might imagine, because she rarely spoke about public policy while First Lady, and not very much afterwards either. Now, her interest in politics, not surprisingly, was how did it affect her husband? So she spoke quite highly of people who were supportive, loyal, dependable to JFK and his career. That was the only real standard she had. And that could even go inside the family. She said Bobby Kennedy was quite unselfish. He was willing to be in the cabinet or not, depending on what her brother wanted. But she also noted her sister-in-law Eunice, who kept pushing for her husband, Sergeant Schreiber, to be in the cabinet, as Jackie said, because she wanted to be a cabinet secretary's wife. So if someone was with Jack, Jackie was complimentary. If not, she could be quite harsh. So people like Mike Mansfield, the U.S. Majority Leader in the early 60s and beyond, Jacqueline spoke quite highly of. But then there were other folks who gave her husband trouble. Ross Barnett, the governor of Mississippi, and George Wallace of Alabama, who clashed on civil rights. Adlai Stevenson, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations during the Kennedy administration, with whom her husband had a very complex relationship. So it seems a bit ironic to hear that most of Kennedy's most difficult relationships were with other Democrats. Now, why is that surprising? Well, in the early 60s, the two political parties were really much more diverse. They were not the ideological monoliths they are today. So there were many a conservative Democrat, many a liberal Republican. Phrases my students look at me baffled at when I mention in class. But because the parties were so broad, Kennedy found himself fighting liberal Democrats, sometimes, other times more conservative Democrats. So, one episode that Jackie gives great weight to that is fairly obscure in most Kennedy books, but I think the better books mention it, is in 1956, JFK was looking to become a national leader, and he wanted to take control of the Massachusetts State Party. To do that, he had to unseat the State Party chairman, a farmer from central Massachusetts known for his main cash crop, William Onions Burke. Onions Burke. So the Onions Burke is not something you would normally associate with John F. Kennedy, of course, but in the 50s, Kennedy was determined to get control of the party away from Burke and his patron, John McCormick, a powerful Irish-American congressman from Boston. So Kennedy and his supporters set out to win control of the State Democratic Committee, and a fierce political struggle ensued. They contacted every member of the committee. There were very contentious meetings. Kennedy was the subject of verbal abuse on more than one occasion. But eventually, at the climactic meeting, the Kennedy forces hired two very tough off-duty Boston cops to look out for things. The other side had Congressman McCormick's 300-pound nephew, Jocko, who wasn't adverse to throwing his weight around, literally and figuratively. It was a closely run contest, but eventually the Kennedys won. And his political team realized this was really a turning point in his career. It was a watershed. His father once said, "Don't get into the gutter with those Irish bums up in Boston. Stay out of that state party, stay out of those local fights." But Kennedy knew in order to make himself a national figure, he had to do this. So his ambition wins out. He wades in, and they put poor Onions Burke in the dustbin of history and move on from there. Well, Jackie Kennedy does not go into great depth in the civil rights matter, which is a bit surprising given its prominence in the early 60s. She does discuss differences that Kennedy had with governors, as I mentioned, Governor Wallace and Ross Barnett. And much of the literature on the question of civil rights during the Kennedy administration confirms this, that the Kennedys were a bit slow to act on civil rights, the critics say, but they also show the tape conversations and meetings that Jack and Bobby often had very tough discussions with Southern Democratic governors. You don't get a sense of great passion by her husband on this issue, which is what his critics have said, that he was slow to move on civil rights. He didn't feel it viscerally or emotionally. He had to be dragged in, much like Lincoln with slavery, perhaps. But maybe the lack of interest was more on Mrs. Kennedy's part. Now, in one of the more jarring sections of these interviews, and I sort of debated whether or not to include this tonight, but I decided I would, Mrs. Kennedy speaks quite harshly of Martin Luther King Jr. She had access to tapes of Dr. King. Apparently the FBI taped him in compromising sexual encounters. They also taped him making negative comments on JFK's funeral that they also taped, because he was not invited, I think, I might explain that, not to the church, St. Andrew's Cathedral. So Jackie said, well, isn't he a phony to her husband? He's a preacher, he presents himself as a moral authority. Isn't he a phony? I mean, isn't this awful? And JFK said, and there's some irony in this, given what we know about him now, that she shouldn't judge him too harshly for his weaknesses of the flesh. And she doesn't comment on that, but you get the point, I can tell. So, the main issue of Kennedy's presidency is the Cold War, and Jackie comes back to it over and over again. She demonstrates how central it was to her husband. She comments on Cuba, the failed Bay of Pigs episode. The Kennedy circle called Bay of Pigs the first Cuba, and the Cuban Missile Crisis the second Cuba. I never knew that. It's kind of fun to know that. It doesn't really change our view of those things, but inside logo and lingo on that issue. So she also says that her husband wept in her presence in the White House quarters after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. I think that Kennedy was deeply shaken by that failure. He was not used to failure as a politician, as a public figure, as a president. He had setbacks on his health for sure, but not as a person making important decisions. I think he questioned briefly his own judgment. his ability to make these important decisions that presidents during the Cold War are hired to do. One person who knew Kennedy well said in the summer of '61, after the Bay of Pigs, talking to him was like talking to a statue. So I think Jackie corresponds that account. Her memories of the Vienna Conference with Khrushchev, not seeing here, also closely correspond to what most historians have written about that meeting that I mentioned earlier. So Jackie said that her husband found working with Khrushchev someone who just exhibited naked, brutal, ruthless power. And again, Kennedy was not ready for Nikita Khrushchev. He had met some tough politicians in Chicago, Boston, across the country, but American politicians in the mid-20th century and Soviet politicians have a very different training and background and are shaped by different things. Khrushchev was in Stalin's inner circle. He wasn't about to be intimidated by the millionaire's son from Boston who was younger than his own son. Now, Khrushchev was only 5'1", which is hard to believe. Kennedy was 6'1", but Khrushchev was not intimidated. And as Kennedy said after the meeting, he just beat the hell out of me. And Jackie confirms that it was really a grim encounter in Vienna in which Kennedy left thinking nuclear war was possible. Well, of course, it almost happened in October of '62. And these memories of that, she talks about talking to her husband, hearing his voice on the phone, asking her to come back to D.C., and she said she could tell by the sound of his voice something was wrong. She could just tell that it wasn't his usual upbeat self. It wasn't his usual upbeat self. So when she learns that war with Russia was possible, she said, "We want to be here with you. If the worst happens, the children and I will be with you." So like millions of other American families, for that matter Soviet ones as well, in October of '62, it looked very much like World War III was at hand. After it was averted, Kennedy turned his attention to reducing tensions. And Jackie said that he had expressed dismay that so few people in the government were working on issues of disarmament. But Kennedy, working with his great friend and ally, Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister, with the USSR, came to an agreement to ban nuclear testing in the atmosphere in the summer of 1963. Her husband was quite proud of this achievement, and nearly 50 years later, it remains a significant milestone in reducing the tensions at the height of the Cold War. Well, one issue that Jackie mentions only lightly here was Vietnam. She basically used it as an example of mentioning something serious in the evening, and one night she said to her husband, "What's new in Vietnam these days?" And he said, "I've been working in Vietnam all day. I don't want to hear about it. Please, no more questions on Vietnam." So she said, "Fine, we'll change the subject." So obviously, she had no inkling what was coming next, but her husband did feel that, as he told advisors, we might be overcommitted in Vietnam. But he just started to figure out what to do about that situation when he was killed. Jackie also described her husband's shock and horror at the death of the Diem brothers in Vietnam in early November of '63. They led the U.S. government there, but the U.S. encouraged a coup. We didn't encourage their assassinations or executions, but the Army killed them anyway, and given the fact that his own death by assassination was only 3 weeks away, gives an eerie foreshadowing to that situation. Well, I thought long and hard about how to conclude tonight, and John F. Kennedy remains something of an enigma. His wife said he was an elusive man. Once at a history conference, I questioned a historian who had written 2 really good books on Kennedy. So over a beer in the lobby where the best talks at history conferences go on, as those of you who have been to any one of those know what I mean, I asked him, "Well, what do you think about JFK? You've written 2 books on him, you've studied the records, you've looked into his life," and he was really neither pro-Kennedy or anti-Kennedy. I said, "What can you tell me about JFK? What is your conclusion?" He didn't really have one. He said basically what Jackie said. He's elusive, he's an enigma, he's not easily compartmentalized. But I think Maybe I'll give one of the last words tonight to a poet. Poets in the audience, you might appreciate this. Walt Whitman, the great 19th century American poet, once said, in Song of Myself, "Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes." Maybe there's something of John F. Kennedy in that he doesn't quite add up to an easy equation. There's different aspects of his life, some admirable, some less than admirable. Trying to put them together is not always easy. Perhaps his compartmentalization was really not the basis for a fully integrated life in the moral sense, in the Christian sense. I think that's a fair statement. But I think his wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, who knew him well, should get the last word. And she said that I think she got close to the essence of her husband when she told Schlesinger that he was really like those British Whig politicians of the 18th and 19th century. A man of great privilege and wealth, a man for whom life had very little material want, who took their pleasures in life, to be sure, but were at the same time profoundly serious men who tried to live lives of meaning and purpose. I think that is a part of John F. Kennedy's legacy, one that despite his own many contradictions endures. Thank you.